Hello everyone. This is What If Luffy got all his powers at a young age. Please like and subscribe, 8 likes for next part and enjoy. Help me, Luffy. Nami said desperately. She tried to get her freedom on her own, but after telling Arlong that she has the money required, he acted quickly and sent Nezumi to retrieve it to stop her from leaving. His plan worked and Nezumi left with the money, leaving Nami desperate. Meanwhile, Usopp was busy trying not get killed, Zoro was cutting random fishmen and trying not to get lost, and Johnny was being completely useless as usual. After learning of Nami's misfortune with Nezumi, the villagers took up their weapons, well, not really weapons, just whatever sharp or large objects they could find. Yusaku and Johnny ran ahead, trying to defeat Arlong out of anger, but which was a mixed blessing since, well, they got beat up, but they also managed to prevent the villagers from getting themselves killed. Luffy took his hat from his head and put it on Nami's head. Her crying stopped. She knew the hat meant a lot to him. "Keep that safe and follow behind us," he whispered. He walked towards the rest of his crewmates. "We're going," he told them. They all stood up. They walked towards Arlong Park together, Luffy in front. Flashback. Luffy stepped over several marine bodies and found the body of Nami, but it was almost completely burned by magma. The only reason he even recognized her was because of her orange hair and clean attacked. Luffy gritted his teeth and clenched his fist, unknowingly using armament and making it shiny black. An action that did not go unnoticed by the rest of his crew. As he approached the villagers, who were arguing with the pirate hunters, Luffy finally relaxed a bit, feeling Nami following far behind them. "I won't make it repeat itself," Luffy thought. "I swear it. Move it." Luffy commanded and the people moved aside, clearing a path for them. Luffy and the others moved forward, and when they nearly reached, Luffy stopped for a bit. "Listen guys," he said quietly. "I need each of you to take an enemy down. Arlong has 3 lieutenants, an ideal number." Usopp paled at this, knowing he couldn't avoid fighting. "Zoro, you take the fishman with 6 arms. He's a swordsman, but don't kill him." Zoro nodded. "Sanji, yours is the guy with weird things on his elbows. You'll know when you see him." Sanji nodded. "Usopp." The sharpshooter cringed. "You take the guy with the big lips. Use whatever tricks you have, we aren't white knights. Be careful, the guy is very strong, but you'll be able to take him." Usopp was shaking, but he nodded. "Alright." Luffy nodded and started walking again. He heard annoying laughter ahead. "Armament," he murmured and without stopping, walked straight through the giant gates, leaving a human-shaped hole in the gates. The 3 straw hats all sweat dropped and the rest of them had their jaws on the ground. After a second, the gates cracked and collapsed. Arlong and his men blinked several times trying to determine whether what they saw had indeed happened. Luffy stepped forward with his fist clenched. "Which one of you is Arlong?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. "Arlong?" A tough-looking fishman with a saw-shaped nose answered. "That would be my name." Luffy launched forward and hit Arlong with his fist, sending him flying. The fishman crashed into a stone wall, destroying a part of it. Luffy made sure he didn't use any haki or too much strength. "Don't you dare make my navigator cry," Luffy yelled on top of his lungs. "Your navigator?" Arlong replied mockingly. "And who the hell are you, anyway?" "I'm Monkey D. Luffy and I'm the future Pirate King," he replied. "Pirate King?" Arlong repeated. A few of the fishmen nearby snorted. "Like a human like you could become Pirate King." One of them yelled and he along with most other fishmen attempted to attack Luffy, but they were kicked away by Sanji, who just arrived on the scene. "Don't hog all the prey," he told his captain. Then said man sat down on the ground. "What are you doing?" asked Sanji. "I'm letting you take care of things," Luffy announced. He pointed at Arlong. "After you're done, I'm taking care of Ugly Nose over there." "Why you human bastard?" Arlong yelled, gritting his teeth. "How dare you insult Arlong-sama?" Kurobe yelled out. Luffy just laughed. Sorry Arpong," Luffy said in a completely insincere tone, mispronouncing the name on purpose. Kurobe jumped to attack Luffy in anger, but was stopped by Sanji's kick. Zoro stepped forward to challenge Hachi. Usopp peeked from the corner of the building, then stepped forward and proudly raised his chest, while shaking. The great Captain Usopp-sama will take you on," he announced, took his slingshot and shot you. The fishman was angered. "Why you?" he screamed and ran after Usopp, who was already far away from the park. Everyone's sweat dropped. "You know Sanji begun. I'm fine with us fighting, but that may be a little too much for Long Nose." Luffy shook his head and waved his hand as if hitting a fly. "Nah," he said. "Usopp can take him. Besides, even if he does get a beating, I'd much rather have him get it sooner rather than later, when the enemies will be far deadlier." Zoro and Sanji blinked. Did he just say something smart? They both thought. Then Hachi walked away toward the ocean, much to the confusion of Zoro. He played his trumpet like octopus mouth. "Mamu," he called. After a few moments a gigantic sea cow appeared out of the ocean. "Mamu, take care of them," he called out. The sea cow menacingly looked over his targets until his gaze ended on the boy with the straw hat who was seated on the stone ground. Its eyes widened. "Hey you." Luffy yelled and waved. "I remember you." Sea cow's memory. Mamu was just enjoying swimming around when he smelled something yummy. He swam towards the smell and came across the Barati. On a balcony on the upper floor of the restaurant, a boy with a straw hat was sitting. He had many plates of meat on the large table. Mamu eyed the food hungrily and started drooling. "Why are you looking at my meat?" Luffy asked. He stood up. "You want to steal my food, huh? Get lost, jerk." Luffy yelled at Mamu and punched him, sending him flying. Mamu started shaking and sweating and then swam away as fast as it possibly could. "What's gone into him?" Luffy asked in a confused tone. Sanji face-palmed, remembering Mamu himself. Then they clashed. Luffy watched as Zoro barely kept himself up because of the wounds. Despite this, Hachi clearly had no chance against him and was barely able to touch him. Kurobe and Sanji were somewhat evenly matched. Sanji was faster and was able to dodge all attacks, but Kurobe was stronger and managed to block many attacks using his arms and large elbows. Then Arlong stood up. "Oh Nami, did you come to see me destroy those idiots?" he asked. Shahahaha. True to his word, Nami stood in front of the villagers. Sanji looked towards her and Kurobe used a distraction to send him flying through the wall with a heavy punch. Zoro did not allow himself to get distracted. "No Arlong," she replied, holding her shoulder, which Luffy noticed was now bandaged. "I came to see you get beaten." Arlong laughed and as on a cue, Usopp came running back and Sanji slowly stood up and walked toward his opponent while muttering something about punches. "They're stupid, Armbong," Luffy then announced. "My guys are kicking your guys' butts." Sanji, Nami and the villagers couldn't help but smile at the simple words, while Usopp raised his chest proudly and announced that Captain Usopp is the coolest warrior because he finished first. The battles lasted a few more minutes and then Zoro finally finished his fight with Hachi and shortly after that Sanji kicked Kurobe straight through Arlong Park. Then Luffy stood up. "Yosh," he announced in a childish tone. "Now that 6 arms, weird elbows and big lips are finished, I'll be taking ugly nose over there." While saying those last words he rudely pointed towards Arlong. The man or rather the fishman was fuming. How dare he? First they kill my comrades, then he insults them. On the outside however, he appeared calm. He jumped towards Luffy, trying to bite him, but Luffy dodged and Arlong bit a column instead. The column cracked and was completely destroyed. Everyone was horrified at his strength except Luffy, who was instead thinking about the celebration that would follow this. "You see this? This is the true strength of a fishman. Humans will never be." Arlong started. "Then stop talking and show me." Luffy interrupted him. "If fishmen are so great, then you should have no problems with me, now." Arlong gritted his teeth in anger and launched forward. He used all kinds of attacks. He tried to punch, kick, bite and whatever he could think of, but Luffy dodged everything. And rather easily at that. Also, with every strike that missed, Arlong became more and more enraged. "TSK, TSK, TSK. If as a fishman, you're that strong, why are you in the weakest sea then?" Luffy asked while dodging, fueling Arlong's anger even further. "Shut up, human," he yelled. "Also why haven't you killed any admirals yet then?" Luffy asked again in a confused tone as he dodged a vicious-looking kick. "I'll kill you, human. I swear I'll kill you," roared Arlong and jumped into the water. Luffy looked at the pool and saw Arlong's fin. "Oh, a shark," he yelled excitedly. Everyone fell over. "Shark on darts," Arlong announced and jumped out of water, aiming for Luffy's heart with his nose. At first it seemed as if Arlong had succeeded and a few people screamed in horror, but upon closer inspection, you could notice that Luffy was holding Arlong's nose with his hand. "At lost," he yelled and threw him into Arlong Park. He crashed into it but immediately jumped towards Luffy, attempting his signature attack a few more times. "You coward. Are you dodging because you're scared?" he yelled out. Luffy sighed. "Idiot. You know, Armlong, as a general rule, I don't like having my chest pierced." Luffy whined. His crew members behind him couldn't help but snicker. The villagers were gawking at them, shocked at what the great tyrant of East Blue had been reduced to. "Why you damn human." Arlong yelled and punched him with all his might. Luffy decided to humor him and did not even bother to dodge and instead released a small amount of haki to shield himself. The villagers and crew members watched with their jaws hanging as their hero received a punch to the face and did not budge an inch. Arlong pulled back his fist and stared in horror. "I thought superior meant better. Guess I was wrong," Luffy said and scratched behind his ear. "I gave you 20 minutes to prove you're better than me. I didn't attack, I didn't use my devil fruit and I barely moved. Guess you were proving something else. Arlong's eyes then changed and he lost whatever restraint he had left. He punched into Arlong Park and grabbed something and pulled it out. Luffy's sweat dropped. That's an interesting way of getting something. Nami's eyes widened in horror. No Kiribachi. He only uses that when he wants to wreck everything. She yelled. Arlong ran towards Luffy and Luffy jumped up. He crashed into a room in Arlong Park, a room he remembered well. Arlong followed. He had no more restraint left, so he simply slashed left and right. Luffy sidestepped his slashes, and Arlong mainly cut Nami's maps. Luffy punched the table out of the room, as well as several stacks of paper. "What are you doing?" he yelled at him. Luffy laughed while dodging. "Oh, are you angry, Arlong? Are you?" Luffy asked. But then his eyes darkened. "But I bet you're not as angry as me. You made my Nakama cry." Then he punched Arlong out of the building. He landed underneath the park, where they fought first. There was map paper all over the plaza. "Your Nakama?" Arlong asked as he picked himself up. "What can you do with her? You can't use her as well as I can. She may be human, but she's got talent. If the rest of humans are like dirty mice, she's like a clever cat." Luffy decided he had enough of him. "Armament," he murmured. His arm turned shiny black and he threw a punch at Arlong. He tried to block it with his Kiribachi, but the weapon was broken immediately upon contact and Arlong was sent flying. Everyone watched in awe as Arlong struggled to even get up after that punch. He did not look like someone punched him. Luffy's knuckles were imprinted on his chest and he was spitting blood. "Look at your park for the last time, Arlong," Luffy announced and unsheathed his sword. "AKAINAMI red, wave." Luffy announced and slashed the air a few times, sending several flying blade attacks towards the building, cutting it cleanly several times. The building collapsed into itself. Arlong looked at it in horror and then he collapsed himself. "Hey, guys," Luffy yelled. "I have something for you." Nijiko, Genzo and a few of the other guys approached Luffy with surprised expressions. "What is it, kid?" Genzo asked. Luffy handed them the items in his hands. "What's this?" "Flags," Nijiko asked as she looked at them. Luffy nodded. "If you hang them in each village I'm pretty sure it'll keep any pirates away," Luffy told them. "Also, Johnny and Yusaku said they would stay here, so I'll help protect you if you ask them." "Don't be stupid. We can't be protected by a pirate," Genzo stated. Luffy shook his head. "Might as well be. The government clearly doesn't give a damn, but they'll at least leave you alone if I claim this island," he told him. Nijiko shrugged. "What do you want in return?" she asked. Luffy shook his head again with a smile. "You already threw us a feast and gave us supplies for the journey. I don't need anything else." A few hours and a weird goodbye later. "Nami Swan. 3 Sanji announced proudly. Your security guard of love is at your service." "Arigato, Sanji-kun," Nami thanked in a sweet voice. "Hey, Nami, can I get a tangerine?" Luffy asked. Nami's eye twitched. "Why should I give it to you? And how do I know you won't take more than one?" she asked. Luffy shrugged. "Well, you can give me one because I'd like to see what it tastes like," he answered. "You've never eaten a tangerine before?" she asked. Luffy shook his head. "Not that I'd remember," he replied. She stared at him dumbfounded. "How do I know you won't steal them all?" she then finally asked with half-lidded eyes. "Well, then I wouldn't even ask you. I'd beat the crap out of Sanji and take them," Luffy answered in a whiny tone. "Hey!" yelled Sanji. Then he put his finger on his chin and gained a thoughtful expression. "Or maybe I'd use my speed and steal them without anyone noticing," he announced. "Or I could steal them at night." Nami abruptly stood up. "What?" asked Luffy confused. Why you're actually making sense," she yelled. Luffy tilted his head. "Shouldn't I?" he asked. "But you're Luffy. You're a moron," she told him. "I'm not a moron," he yelled in outrage. "Boy Nami?" Luffy asked after a few moments. "What's a moron?" Everyone's sweat dropped. "Can I get a tangerine now?" Luffy asked after a moment. Nami wordlessly walked towards the plant, plucked a good ripe one, and handed it to him. Luffy smiled and peeled the fruit and then ate the fruit slowly, which freaked the girl out. "What?" he asked again. "Why are you eating so slowly?" she asked him. He sighed. "Do enjoy the taste?" he asked back. She stared. He ate the last slice, then he laid down. "It's good," he announced. A news bird then arrived and Nami stood up, took a newspaper and paid, complaining about the price. She sat down again and opened the newspaper and a paper flew out. Luffy ran after it and picked it up. He grinned as he looked at it. At Marineford. These were all high bounty pirate captains and he took them all out. A green-haired man said and pointed at 3 wanted posters. "Easily at that. From what I hear, he wasn't even wounded. Not even once," he continued. And the pirates were formed less than a month ago. Do we have any information on him? A Marine Vice Admiral asked. None, sir. Branu answered. Given his unknown origin, we can't really know how strong he really is yet, but the government has decided on a price. He put a wanted poster with Luffy's smiling face on the wall with the other three. This bounty is a true record for East Blue. Nobody has ever been given such a high first bounty in East Blue yet, and there are only a few people in other seas who surpass it, most notably perhaps Bo Hancock, Royal Shichibukai and the Demon Child. The government however believes that the figure is reasonable, given how easily he dealt with his enemies. At Marineford, Fleet Admiral's office. Garp walked through a wall into the office. Hey, look at this, Sengoku. Garp yelled and put a wanted poster on his desk. Yes, I already saw this. The head of the Marines said in an irritated expression. Now if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Wahahaha, that's my grandson. Garp proclaimed proudly. Garp, Sengoku said. I'll never get it how you can be proud of such a family. The Marine hero sighed. He's still my grandson and even if he is a pirate, at least he's a good one. Garp muttered and turned to leave. Use the door next time. Sengoku yelled after him. Garp turned around and huffed. Nope, not cool enough. And then proceeded to close the door of the office and walk through it, leaving another man-shaped hole. Garp. On some unknown island on the Grand Line. Yo, Hawkeyes, have you come to challenge me to a sword fight? A red-haired man asked. Mihik shook his head. Perhaps later. I have some things to discuss. He said and revealed a bounty poster. Shanks smiled. After he dueled with me, beat Don Krieg with one slash and scared the hell out of everyone else, he told me to be his messenger to a Yonkou. Mihik told him in a totally emotionless tone. Shanks blinked. Ahahaha, just as I expected. He'll surpass even Al-Shirohige in a few years. Shanks announced. Then he sighed. Honestly, every time I think about that kid I always think that I had to be drunk that whole month. But then Ben always reminds me that it really happened. Shanks continued. So, what's his message? Mihik sat down next to Shanks. He said that he will enter paradise in about a week. He said. Shanks nodded. That's good to hear. Anything else? He asked. That's the problem, red-haired. He said he is counting on you, but I don't know about what. Hawkeye continued. Shanks laughed and patted his back. Don't worry about it, Hawkeyes. He's just reminding me of something. He said. Now, Hawkeyes. Shanks announced in a fake menacing tone. I can't let you just leave here. On the Moby Dick. Hey, Sabo, come here, Yoi. A blonde pineapple-headed male called out. What is it, Marco? A blonde-haired man with a blue hat and clothes asked and went in his direction. Marco chuckled and handed him a wanted poster. Sabo took it and looked at it. His eyes bulged out. LLU Luffy. He stuttered. The amount under his name startled him. What the hell? Marco smirked. Is there a problem, Sabo? He asked. Sabo looked at him dumbfounded. He's got higher first bounty than my and Ace's first bounty combined. He said. Can't wait to tell Ace, Yoi. Marco said with an evil expression as he grabbed the poster back. Sabo's sweat dropped. Hey Ace. He yelled. What? A voice asked. Marco turned around and saw Ace. Yo, fireman. He called. The fireman puts out fire, Marco. Ace said with a twitch. I am fire. Whatever. Marco dismissed him. Check this out, Yoi. Ace took the poster and looked at it for a full minute. Then he looked at Sabo, then at Marco. Tell me this is a joke. He said. Marco and Sabo blinked in confusion. No, it's real, Yoi. Damn it, he was right. Ace muttered. Sabo looked confused. Ace sighed and proceeded to explain. He said, and I quote. Your bounties will be tiny compared to mine. He did say that. Sabo confirmed. Ace sighed, but smiled now. I need to show this to Pops. He said and walked away. A few minutes later. Look, Pops. Ace exclaimed and practically shoved the poster into Whitebeard's head. This is my little brother. The Yonkou took the poster and looked at it. So that's the brat, eh? He said with a quirked eyebrow. Yep. That's my weak little brother. Ace repeated. Whitebeard looked at him in confusion. What? Ace asked. The Yonkou coughed. Well, I wouldn't say he was weak, given what is written on this poster. Whitebeard told him. He has a huge first bounty, and it says here that he took out the best of East Blue without getting winded even once. Elsewhere on the ship. Sabo stares at Teach eating a pie and gets an awful sense of foreboding. Marco notices this and comes over to him. What's wrong, Yoi? He asked. Sabo shook his head. It's just something Luffy said. He told us to stay away from fat pirates with missing teeth and bushy chest hair that like pies. He raised his hand when an angry Marco tried to say something. No, I'm not joking. He actually said that. Those exact words. Sabo said and Marco stared at him in bewilderment. Well, that seems oddly specific. Marco said with a sweat drop. Did he say why, Yoi? Sabo smirked. He said that we should stay away unless we want to get raped. Marco fell over. He actually said that? Marco asked incredulously. When he was 11 no less. Sabo said. Well, Marco said in a deadpan voice as he patted Sabo's shoulder. You sure have one interesting brother. Back on the going merry. Check this out guys. Luffy called and turned his wanted poster around so that everyone could see. The crew members, including Zoro who was sleeping only moments ago, all walked towards him and looked at the poster. It read. Monkey D. Luffy. Wanted dead or alive. 70.000.000, Barry. Luffy was snoring with drool coming out of his mouth. Meat he muttered, but then a boot kicked his head. What? He said and tried to stretch, but he couldn't move. Where am I? Damn it, sea stone. He thought. Diahahaha. Hey Mugiwara. A high-pitched voice nearby announced. Welcome to the execution. Luffy looked at him and his lips twitched. Even in the face of death he still couldn't resist it. Cool. I've always wanted to see an execution. He beamed. The clown almost fell over. It's your execution. He yelled. What? He exclaimed. No way. He chuckled silently to himself as the clown muttered something about stupidity and straw hats. Now look good, fair Lady Alvida as I decapitate this bastard. Buggy yelled. He looked down and indeed he saw a skinny Alvida in the front line. Alvida. Luffy repeated. He looked around in every direction. But I don't see any whales, let alone super-sized ones. He had to concentrate hard not to roar out in laughter as he could see Alvida's face get more and more red before she erupted. I'm not a whale. She yelled. Luffy looked at her and blinked several times. Of course you're not. Luffy told her in a childish tone. You're not Alvida. I am Alvida, bastard. She yelled as a tick formed above her eye. But you're not a whale. Luffy replied. Alvida gritted her teeth in anger. I never was one. She roared out. Now, Lady Alvida, don't mind this brainless idiot. He won't be alive very much longer. Buggy announced and lifted his sword. Die, Straw Hat. This execution, yelled Sanji. Is over. Finished Zoro. They then fought their way through the pirates, but Luffy knew they were going to be too late. He would have freed himself already, but the sea stone was sapping all of his strength, disabling even his haki. Luffy didn't know if sea stone naturally sapped haki power as well, or if it just weakened him too much to use it, but it didn't matter. The sword began to approach his neck. Luffy knew this could very well be the end if the lighting didn't strike at the right time like the first time. So he smiled. He could see Smoker drop his cigars from his mouth in a building overlooking the plaza, and he wondered what that was all about. Usopp, Sanji, Zoro, Nami. He called out. And Chopper, Robin, Brook, Frankie and Vivi. He added in his mind. Sorry. But I'm dead. Then he grinned content and ready to die. And I'm the one dying this time. He thought, and thinking this his grin widened. He was content. All of his Nakama were still alive and he at least saved 4 of them from their otherwise unhappy fates and there was still hope for the rest. But death didn't come and for once Luffy wasn't mad at it. Lighting struck the platform but Luffy didn't feel anything, only heard it strike. Then the platform collapsed and Luffy fell down with it. Luffy stood up. Maybe Enel saved me, Luffy thought, but then started to snicker. Yeah right. He stepped forward and picked up his straw hat before it hit the ground. He looked at the jaws on the ground and smirked. Well, that was an enlightening experience. Luffy said and then started to giggle. Edit. It's a pun. Luffy told, but nobody would react. You know, enlightening. Luffy tried again. Whatever. Luffy huffed. You're no fun. Then he ran up to Sanji and Zoro and together they ran to the harbor. Zoro was stopped in his tracks by Tashigi. As they ran, Luffy felt a familiar presence. In front of them was none other than Captain Smoker. Smokey. Luffy thought. Flashback. Luffy was sitting on a hilltop overlooking the ocean. As he thought about his crew again, tears slipped down his face. He felt someone behind him. Mugiwara. A familiar voice said. Luffy turned around. It was Smoker. I came to arrest you. He said, but his attention was clearly not on anything but his face, where tears flowed freely. Then do it, Smokey. Luffy said and faced the sea again. Take me and get this over with. So it's true then? Smoker asked and puffed a smoke. You lost your crew? Luffy didn't answer, but he didn't have to. Smoker knew this answer. Akainu is gone too. Disappeared alongside his fleet and a few vice admirals. What? I killed them. Luffy interrupted. Smoker's eyes widened. You never kill, Mugiwara. He replied. I didn't. But it was already like I was dead myself, so might as well betray my principles too. I didn't care anymore and I still don't. Luffy said, his voice crackling. Smoker turned and left him. That was the last time he saw him. Smoker stepped forward. Mugiwara. He growled. I'm Captain Smoker. You're not getting past me. Luffy stopped. Sanji looked at them. Sanji, go ahead. I'll follow after I'm done here. Luffy commanded. Smoker smirked. I wouldn't count on it. He told him. Sanji ran forward, but Smoker didn't stop him. He activated his devil fruit power and turned into smoke. Smoke flew in all directions, and Luffy noted that Smoker was trying to trap him. This was something he always respected about Smoker. He never really attempted to kill, always only to catch. Luffy activated his Zoro for a moment and jumped into air, dodging the smoke that tried to form around him. Smoke followed him. Luffy kicked the smoke away, much to the surprise of his foe. The hockey user in the east. Smoker muttered in disbelief. Then he jumped towards Luffy again and attempted to hit him with his jut, but Luffy easily caught his arm. I'm sorry Smokey. Luffy told him as he gritted his teeth in frustration. But your hockey is shitty. Train some more and challenge me again. Smoker growled and tried to strike again, but Luffy punched him hard in the gut. He didn't use too much hockey though, as Smoker was one of those rare marines that he truly respected. He dropped the unconscious but otherwise relatively undamaged Smoker on the ground. He looked at him for a moment, but then he heard footsteps in the rain. He turned around and saw a man covered in a green cloak approaching. Lighting flashed and a moment he could see the man's face. It was covered with tattoos. Flashback. I hear your dad saw you off at Logtown. His name is Monkey D. Dragon. He's a revolutionary. My comrade, Revolutionary Dragon. Son of Dragon. That's your punishment, Mugiwara. For the sin of being born. Dragon? Luffy asked quietly. The man kept walking towards him. Or, should I say, Dad. Luffy continued. The man was now in front of him and they looked at each other. Luffy looked at him with half-lidded eyes. Or maybe the best way to describe you would be sperm donor from hell. Luffy exclaimed after a moment of silence. The man stiffened for a bit but then started chuckling. You know, if I was Ace, I'd hate you and I'd be trying to kill you right about now. Luffy said. The man paused in his amused laughter. Ace is my brother. Luffy answered the question that was never asked. As is Sabo. Brothers? The man said. You don't have any brothers. Not blood ones, no. Luffy confirmed. The man tilted his head slightly. Ace as in pork is the Ace and Sabo as in his crewmember Sabo? He asked. Luffy nodded. The man's eyes widened slightly, but it seemed as if Dragon was used to surprises. So why don't you hate me? The man asked. You have every right to. Luffy sighed. You have done nothing yet. I have no reason to hate you. Luffy answered honestly. The man nodded. Luffy. Don't misunderstand me. Luffy interrupted. You aren't a father to me. I don't hate you. It's just that I'm indifferent to you. I don't care about you at all. I don't care about faceless strangers. But I am your father. Dragon protested. Luffy shook his head. No, you're a stranger who happens to be the sperm donor. If you want me to care about you, do something to make me care. Luffy turned to leave, but then turned back for a bit. And for the record, I hate the government too. Luffy said and put his hand on his scar. As he turned around, a wild wind flew forth and carried him and his crew to his ship. Well, it's a start. Luffy thought as he landed on the ship. Dragon stood in the harbor. Damn. That was cold. He sighed. Zoro noticed his unhappy disposition and put his hand on his shoulder. What's wrong? He asked him. Luffy sighed again. I met my father in Logtown before we left. He told him. Zoro stared at him. For the first time. Luffy added when Zoro obviously didn't know what was the matter. Zoro sighed. I see. He told him. So how did it go? Luffy chuckled softly. I was a total ass to him. He answered after a moment of silence. Zoro blinked. I told him that until he actually does something I don't care about him and see him as a stranger. Luffy continued. Zoro sighed. You were a jerk, yes. Zoro confirmed. But I honestly can't blame you. I'd probably do worse and smack him a few times and. Hate to interrupt your bonding, but we're about to crash. Nami interrupted. Luffy looked ahead and saw what looked like a giant mountain. Shit, Laboon. Thought Luffy. He was unable to stop the figurehead from breaking off and went pretty mad there for a moment. Then the whale swallowed the ship and he entered the whale through a hatch on the top. Then he found his way to the stomach and almost fell in it. Two people who were apparently inside with him did fall in it. He rocketed himself into the ship just as Zoro was being restrained to not kick the crap out of Crocus for some reason. He crashed into them. Sanji managed to grab himself into the fence, but Zoro was thrown over it, straight into the whale's digestive juices, while displaying his colorful mastery of curse language. Yuck. Then two people climbed over the railing. One was a brown-haired man in green clothes with a crown on his head and the other was a blue-haired girl. Flashback. Why do you sit there, Luffy-san? Isn't it dangerous? You're a devil fruit user. It's my special seat. Don't worry, I won't fall. Only right now, she wasn't acting anything like that. She seemed like the typical Baroque works agent. Luffy didn't know whether it was a facade or the influence of her partner, who was actually quite annoying. They acted like they owned their boat and attempted to kill Laboon with their bazooka. Crocus intercepted their attack. Luffy wondered how the old man was able to do that without getting heavily injured. He seemed normal enough to him. Luffy then knocked them both out. After a few minutes of talking with Crocus, who explained about Laboon to them. Then they exited the whale's stomach. After a while, Luffy proceeded to fight with Laboon and then painted a deformed Straw Hat Jolly Roger on his front to stop him from damaging his head any further. After a few minutes of conversations. Nami was eyeing her compass with a bewildered expression. Luffy lied on the grass of the small island near Laboon and watched the sky. Usopp was on the ship fixing things. Zoro was there, sleeping. Sanji arrived, carrying food. "Here's your food," Nami Swan Sanji exclaimed and twirled around in his love noodle form whilst still carrying the plates, which always impressed Luffy. "Hey, Sanji-kun, the compass seems to be broken," she told him. Sanji put his plates down and looked at it. Luffy started eating. "You're right, Nami-san. It's spinning randomly," he added. Crocus laughed from his chair and everyone looked at him except Luffy, who was eating Nami's food. "That simple compass won't get you anywhere in the Grand Line," he told them. Nami looked at him with a horrified expression. The nature here in paradise and even more so in the New World is far too unpredictable for such a simple thing as a compass to work. "Then what do we need?" asked Nami. Crocus chuckled. "You didn't come very prepared, did you, young lady?" he asked in an amused tone. "You're going to need a log pose." "This is serious, why are you laughing?" Nami yelled at him. Crocus pointed at Luffy's hand which was offered to Nami, holding an actual log pose. Those weirdos dropped it. Nami took the log pose and simultaneously punched Luffy, who of course wasn't really affected but whined nonetheless. "Why did you punch me, Nami?" he asked childishly. Nami huffed. "Just because," she said. Luffy pouted. "Whatever," he told her and stuck his tongue out. "You punch like a girl." "I am a girl," she shouted and proceeded to punch him, but before she could, Sanji got angry on her behalf. "Why you shitty rubber?" he yelled. "First you eat my Nami-san's food and then you insult her." And then he kicked him in the head. Which did absolutely nothing of course, except make a small red mark on Luffy's face. "Sanji-kun," Nami suddenly muttered in a dark menacing tone that promised death. Luffy and Sanji both looked at her and noticed that the log pose had broken from the wind of the kick. Sanji tried to plead innocent but Nami would have none of it and proceeded to beat the crap out of him. Luffy laughed as she did so, but as Sanji laid on the ground in a heap, Nami turned his attention to him and approached him in a pitch dark but also somewhat gloomy aura. "As for you, monkey boy," she muttered darkly. Luffy's sweat dropped. As she neared him, he put his hand up. "Wait, Nami," he told her in a calm tone. Nami stopped out of confusion. He didn't sound like he was making an excuse or trying to prevent being beaten. "Wait a second, Nami," he said and opened one of his pockets. He pulled out a box, which although not very big still barely fit in his pocket. "I hope it's still okay after all that," he thought and put the box on the ground. Opened it. Everyone looked at it. Inside the box was a small knife with an exquisitely shaped handle, a small badge with a straw hat Jolly Roger, which Luffy didn't ever wear for some reason, a few other objects and another very small box. A bit bigger than the size of the kind of box where you'd put an engagement ring or something like that. Luffy took it and gave it to her. She opened it and gasped. Inside it was another log pose. She then proceeded to hug Luffy, at which he sweat dropped. Women and their mood swings. He thought. The hypocrite that he has given his own demon persona. She looked at Luffy, then at the log pose and then at Luffy again. "What?" he asked in a deadpan expression. "You actually came prepared," Nami almost screamed. Luffy just looked at her confused. "Don't look at me like that," she yelled at him, but then calmed a bit and sighed. "It's just that it seems so unlike you. You never plan your battles. You don't care about our food stocks and just eat everything in sight. And you didn't even have a ship when we first met or any crew members or nothing." "Nami," Luffy replied in his "you're very stupid and here's why" tone. "Firstly, I only had 18 million berry when I set out. That's not enough for any kind of ship. Secondly, I don't need to plan against weaklings and thirdly I always eat until I'm full. Gramps taught me to do that." Nami and Sanji stared at him dumbly. What's happening? He's making sense again. After more conversations, repairs, naps, begging from Vivi and Mr. 9, as well as setting sail. After a lesson in Grand Line weather, much to Luffy's hidden amusement, when it finally stopped snowing and they were relaxing on the deck, even the guests, Luffy came from the storage room of the ship with a few bandanas and wooden sticks. They all looked at him and got a terrible feeling. "Luffy, what are you?" Nami started. "Time for hockey training, guys." Luffy interrupted. Everyone blinked. "The what training, Luffy?" Zoro asked on the other's behalf. "Hockey," Luffy said, but as they still looked at him, still confused, Luffy proceeded to explain. "Oh, that's right. You don't know about it yet. So let me explain." He sat down on the wooden ground, put down his items, and everyone came over to him. As they sat down in a circle, Vivi and Mr. Nine sat down next to the railing, intrigued by the mysterious hockey, but didn't want to come closer. Luffy sighed. "Hockey is sort of like weaponized ambition. My sensei told me that it's present in all people, but few manage to get it out." Luffy told them. They listened intently. "My sensei called hockey the act of not doubting. He said that is true strength." "The act of not doubting?" Zoro repeated dumbfounded. Luffy nodded. "Those who have no doubts fight better," he told them. Zoro and Sanji nodded, knowing this to be true. That's also why people who are already strong or strong-willed normally learn it faster. "So what can hockey do?" Usopp asked. "Plenty of things." Luffy began. "Increase your strength, protect your body, reflect attacks, better avoid attacks and other things." They all looked at him in bewilderment. "Then hockey is incredibly useful," Zoro concluded. They all nodded, but Luffy shook his head. "Now it's useful," he said. "But as we get deeper and deeper into the Grand Line, it'll become a must." "But how will those things help us train hockey?" Zoro asked and pointed at the bandanas and sticks. Luffy shook his head again. "First let me tell you more about it. There are 3 forms of hockey, as I've said," he said. Zoro nodded again. "First, observation hockey. It allows you to feel the presence of beings and things around you." Luffy said and stood up. He turned away from them and closed his eyes. They looked at him confused. "Zoro," he called. "Try to cut me." The swordsmen looked at everyone. They shrugged, so Zoro took out Wado Ichimonji and attempted to cut Luffy several times. He dodged every attempt with minimal movement, much to their amazement. Luffy then turned back to them and continued. "It only works as long as your concentration is good enough and as long as your enemy strikes aren't random," he told them. "That's amazing," Usopp gasped out. Luffy smiled. "The second is armament hockey. It basically shields your body. It allows you to make your attacks more powerful, shield your body from harm and bypass devil fruit defenses." "Devil fruit defenses?" Nami asked. Luffy nodded. "If you had hockey and hit me and my own hockey didn't shield me, I'd feel the same pain as if I wasn't rubber," he said. "Suji," Usopp said. Luffy looked at Sanji. "Pick me. Once," he ordered. Sanji blinked but then stood up. Luffy held the wrist of his right hand with an open palm with his left hand. The palm of the hand was opened in the direction of Sanji. "I don't know how good this explanation is, but think about Sentomaru if you're confused." Sanji kicked him and Luffy caught his leg with his palm and Sanji was blasted away, almost crashing into Zoro. "Stupid dart bro," Zoro muttered. Luffy tried not to laugh. This was the first time he had heard Zoro insult Sanji in this timeline. "What did you say?" Sanji asked in a threatening tone. "Morimo." "Stop." Luffy ordered and Sanji finally sat down. Both were still glaring at each other. Luffy would have loved to see them fight actually, but this was too important to delay. "I saw your arm turn black a few times. Was that armament hockey?" Zoro asked. Luffy smiled. "Yes, actually, but it's a little bit different. Instead of making armor around my skin, I make skin into armor. If that makes any sense," Luffy said. Then he put his left hand in a fist and muttered armament and the hand turned shiny black like it was supposed to. "Why do you always say armament?" Zoro asked. Luffy's sweat dropped. "Why do you say Santoryu every time?" Luffy asked back. "Good point. Anyway, the last type is the hockey of the conquering king. Or king's disposition." Luffy said and sat down. "Only 1 in a million are supposed to have it. It's a chosen people kind of thing." "How do you know if you can use it?" Usopp asked. Luffy shrugged. "Honestly, you just get stronger and hope it shows along the way," he answered. "Aren't you going to show us?" Zoro asked. Luffy shook his head. "No. Even if it would work, it's not worth it. It's pretty unpleasant," Luffy told them. "Why?" Zoro asked. "It allows you to overpower the minds of other people," Luffy answered and the others looked at him in shock. "Your targets need to be both weak-willed and much weaker than you for it to work. It's good for dealing with weaklings." "What does it do?" Sanji asked. "It literally breaks the minds of your enemies for some time and they collapse. That can't feel too good," Luffy answered and scratched his head. Nami was hit by a sudden realization. "You used it on those 3 pirates in Orange Town," she said and pointed at him. Luffy nodded, but then he stood up, ignoring their shocked faces because of him being one of the chosen ones, and picked up his training equipment. "We'll start with observation," he announced. They looked at him confused. He grinned. "Nami will be paired with Usopp and Sanji will go with Zoro since you're closer in strength that way," he said. "What will we do?" Usopp asked, and as Luffy grinned they got another terrible feeling. "One of you will blindfold himself and sit on the ground and try to dodge the other's hits with the bat. You'll repeat that a few hours every day until you can dodge flawlessly," Luffy said in a cheerful tone. "What?" they all yelled. "Happy training." The few people walked over Luffy, waking him up. He lifted himself and his enlarged stomach up and scratched his head in confusion. "Where am I?" he asked himself. Then he looked around and saw his nakama, except Zoro and Nami, on the ground, sleeping. Flashback. "Welcome to Whiskey Peak, great pirates. We make a party for anyone who makes it this far, so congratulations to you all. Please, follow me and make sure you enjoy yourselves." "Right." Luffy whispered to himself as he remembered. He noticed his large belly was dirty from their footsteps and he cleaned himself a bit after standing up. He heard screaming. "Where the hell is he?" multiple people shout, a bit panicked. Luffy could sense Zoro's aura flicker. He walks towards the door and immediately runs into a man. The man tries to shout to alert others, but Luffy covers his mouth with his hand to prevent him, but then the man swings his sword and very nearly cuts Luffy's large stomach. He then punches the man in the gut and stops his body just as he's about to hit the ground and sets him on the ground quietly. He walks out of the building quietly, careful not to attract any attention. He then checks the top of the house with his observation hockey and is glad to notice that there's nobody on it. Good. He thought and jumped up on a building, landing softly but very nearly falling over as he did. Damn stomach. He thought. Getting in the way. Then he got an idea. I did that once in Impel Down. I should be able to repeat it even though I don't need the energy. He used his rubber powers to get rid of his big stomach, relocating the energy in other parts of his body. He gritted his teeth in pain. Damn, I don't remember this being so painful, he thought with a pout. He looked down at the battlefield. Zoro was speeding past foes, slashing them when he passed. It was abundantly clear the poor agents had no chance. Damn. Luffy thought as he followed Zoro's carnage with pride. It's hard to believe that we were already this good when we barely even entered the Grand Line. Igaram, who Luffy was surprised to see was trying to kill Zoro, forced his unofficial first mate to jump away in order to avoid getting hit by the weird shotgun thing. Zoro proceeded to sheath his white katana and unsheathed Yubashiri, one of the blades he was gifted with. He ran into a few enemies and cut them. Nice katana. It's light and easy to wield. Luffy heard him comment. He furrowed his brows. Complete opposite of that black blade, what was it, Shusui or something like that? Zoro then unsheathed his other new blade, Sandai Kitetsu. Immediately upon doing that, Luffy flinched. He sensed a very dark but also a bit mischievous presence from the blade, and this surprised him. Why do I feel this sword's presence now, and I couldn't ever before? He thought to himself, but then Ida Shida no Kanashimi. Is it because I've become a bit of a swordsman myself? Zoro then cut a few more enemies, and Luffy noticed that his swings with Kitetsu were far deadlier and may have actually outright killed a few, which rarely happened before with Zoro's level of restraint. When he stopped, Zoro clutched the shoulder of the hand that held Kitetsu as if in pain. Damn, what overwhelming bloodlust. Luffy could hear Zoro say. A Mido is only supposed to cut when its master commands. This caught the attention of nearby foes, and Zoro was forced to flee on top of a building. He climbed ladders and went as far as he could go until he was on top. Luffy watched with amusement as Zoro pushed away the ladder, throwing away a dozen or so enemies. Zoro then jumped across to the other side, using the falling ladder to be able to do so. As Zoro landed on the rooftop, he looked somewhat like some sort of a Grim Reaper with a sword in each hand and a somewhat demonic look to his face. Luffy then turned away as he felt a relatively weak but familiar aura flicker. He looked to his left and saw Nami exiting a small building, stuffing a few money notes in her pocket and running to another house. He grinned. As he turned his attention back to Zoro, he couldn't see him anywhere in sight, but he still sensed his presence. He heard a distinctly female voice scream something. Luffy assumed it was an attack name. He watched as the 3 agents assumed the battle was over and he gritted his teeth in annoyance, still clearly feeling Zoro's aura, as powerful as ever. This is insulting. How dare they assume that my first mate was defeated so easily? He thought to himself. On the first island no less. Jerks. But to his captain's pleasure, Zoro soon proved them wrong by defeating the powerful-looking girl who seemed to have defeated him only moments before. The 3 remaining agents looked at Zoro in silence for a few moments, but then the one they called Mr. 8 got a look of sudden realization. I see now. He announced, and the remaining Baroque Works agents looked at him. The Marines must have made a mistake. The bounty must really belong to this guy. He must be the captain. The rest nodded, agreeing with his conclusion. Luffy was beyond annoyed. That's right. Mr. Nine agreed. I should have known that there was no way for such a smiley-faced kid to get such a high bounty. Or to be the captain. Smiley-faced kid. Luffy scowled in annoyance. People who judge their enemies on their appearance alone don't usually live very long on the Grand Line. But then he smirked and sat down on the edge of the roof. Time to teach them something. Yo, Zoro. He called out and waved, interrupting them just as they were about to brag about their number agent status. Everyone looked at him, including Zoro, who was a tad surprised that he was up. When you deal with the trash, come have a drink with me. He announced. Zoro smirked. Sounds good, Captain. He replied after a moment. This earned horrified stares from the group down below. Why you're not the captain? Stuttered Miss Wednesday at Zoro. Luffy face-palmed in disappointment. Even you, Vivi. Luffy saw Zoro smirk in amusement for a moment at his own irritation with him, but then the first mate spoke up. We're the Straw Hat Pirates, idiots. Do you see a straw hat anywhere on my head? Then the battle continued. A few of the men remaining tried to sneak up on Luffy, but he flung them off the roof, sending them head first into the street below. What remained of them was their legs dangling out of the cement, struggling to free the rest of their bodies. Zoro dealt with the 3 remaining threats easily enough, the rest weren't even considered as threats to Zoro by Luffy, and Luffy was well entertained by them. Between Mr.9 and Vivi's incompetence, which he laughed at heartily, Zoro's demonic presence and Mr.8 seconds odd fighting style, Luffy was kept entertained every second. In the end, when Igaram finally fell, Luffy clapped in joy. Great job, Zoro. Luffy said and outstretched his arm to him. Instead of grabbing it, as Luffy expected, Zoro jumped on it and ran on the leg until he reached its roof, at which point he jumped out. He probably didn't trust Luffy to pull him up. Luffy then offered Zoro sake, which he gladly accepted. You're strong. Luffy finally said after a moment of silence and quiet drinking. Zoro snorted and looked at him. That's odd, coming from you. Zoro replied. Luffy shook his head. It's hard to put things into perspective sometimes. Luffy said after another moment of silence. He felt another familiar aura approaching him, but he didn't comment on it. A normal man is plenty strong, but he so very easily dies or is beaten. Then there are stronger men, like Morgan and Django and such, who seem to tower over men. Then there are the likes of Mr. 8 over there, but even they aren't any match for monsters such as you or Sanji. Zoro chuckled, probably finding it funny for Luffy to call him a monster and not the other way around, but remained quiet. After them are people such as government agents, who have trained for their whole lives and dwarf over complete monsters. Then those walking weapons are no match at all for powerful vice admirals, new world captains and the like. Zoro continued to listen silently and poured himself more sake. But even they are humbled by the Shichibukai and Yonkou's closest lieutenants. And yet, as dreadful as they may seem, there are still people above them. The Yonkou, admirals, Mihik. Zoro stiffened a bit and touched his scar, which was finally healing properly. And me. Luffy concluded. Zoro stopped drinking and looked at him. But even we aren't on top, oh no. Luffy continued. Zoro looked at him oddly. But you're on par with an admiral. Zoro exclaimed. You're the strongest there is. Luffy shook his head. As strong as we are still no match for the old legends, the jerks from the old era. The ones truly on top are Whitebeard, Fleet Admiral Sengoku and well, Gramps. Luffy finished. Zoro looked at him wide-eyed. RP's that strong? He asked. Luffy nodded. He is. So, what are you trying to say? Zoro asked jokingly. If it's that you're horribly strong, I already knew that, but thanks. Luffy shook his head and snorted in amusement. I wonder how all this is possible. He said. Monsters who tower over monsters who tower over monsters who tower over monsters who too. I get the idea. Zoro interrupted irritated. What's your point? Luffy looked at him. Zoro, you're the strongest swordsman of East Blue, and yet you're nothing to a guy like say, Doflamingo. He told him. Zoro stiffened a bit at the blunt words. But, Whitebeard would literally walk over that guy. It's screwed up, completely mad. I don't know how everything even works. Well, those were some enlightening words, Captain. A female voice said from behind. Can't say I've expected that from you. Hi Nami. Luffy greeted. Zoro turned around startled. Since when were you here? He asked her. She opened her mouth to answer. Since I started talking. Luffy answered for her. Observation hockey. Luffy said after they looked at him oddly. Luffy invited Nami to sit beside them and gave her a glass of sake. She drank a bit, but then they heard talking. You see, certain members of a certain kingdom seem to have infiltrated our organization. A black-haired man said with an arrogant voice. And so we were sent to eliminate them. Mr. 8 and Mrs. Wednesday seemed to sweat a bit upon hearing this. I'm not a king. Mr.9 protested. It's just my style. You can't. We didn't mean you, idiot. The blonde-haired agent with an umbrella said in irritation. Then the black-haired agent, Mr. 5, pulled out a picture. This caused Mr.8 to react violently and he attacked the duo with his odd weapons. As the captain of guard of Arabasta, I won't let you do this. He yelled. The agent duo was unharmed. Captain of Arabasta Royal Guard, Igaram and Princess of Arabasta, Nefertari Vivi. Mr. 5 announced. Nami spat out her sake. She's a princess. Zoro announced. Nami's eyes turned into berries at which both men's sweat dropped. You know what that means, guys. We're rich if we save her. Go save her, guys. You know, they tried to kill us. Zoro protested. Nami would have none of it. I'll get my billion berry, Zoro. If not from her, then from you. She almost yelled at him. And I think she would pay much more easily than you. A billion is not that much for a kingdom to pay. Luffy stood up and they both looked at him in confusion. You can get a lot of meat with a billion berry. He announced. They both fell over, but Nami got over her shock quickly enough. See, Luffy understands. She said with a smile. Luffy turned to Zoro. Go deal with them. I'll take the Vivi to safety. He told him. So, you infiltrated this Baroque Works group to learn about what their goal was? Nami asked. Vivi nodded. To be fair, we already had the idea that they were planning to overthrow the kingdom, but we just didn't know for sure. She told them. Zoro smirked. That was pretty courageous of you. He complimented her. And not every princess loves her country enough to do something like that. Luffy nodded. Flashback. I'm sorry, I want to come with you, but I love my country and the country needs its princess. Thank you. Vivi replied. But we haven't actually accomplished anything yet. I hate to ask, but would you be willing to get me to Arabasta to at least tell them what we know? Luffy tried to say something. We could get you to Arabasta, Nami begun in a smug tone. But it'll cost you. Let's say a billion berry. Vivi's face fell. Luffy's sweat dropped. She's acting like Vivi asked us to kill Whitebeard or something. He thought. Nami-san, the kingdom could pay that if we were doing good. Vivi replied to the offer in a somewhat desperate tone. But we've been in crisis for a few years now, not to mention we're in a state of war. But you know who is responsible. Luffy said, but it wasn't a question. It was a statement. She nodded anyway. So, who's the mastermind? Zoro asked after a while. Vivi paled and shook her hands in front of her in denial to answer that. I can't possibly tell you that. You'll be targeted. Vivi cried out. Luffy pouted. But we see Zoro began. No. I can't tell you. You saved me and he's a horrible enemy. There's no way you'd be able to even touch him. Vivi yelled. He's the royal Shichibukai, Sir Crocodile. There was silence. Luffy and Zoro's sweat dropped while both Vivi and Nami stared at each other in horror. Then something landed on the roof of the nearby building. Nami slowly turned her head in horror. She saw an otter and a vulture, both on the roof, both wearing shades, looking intimidating. Then she turned around and grabbed Vivi by her clothes and started shaking her wildly while crying comically and shouting at her with shark teeth. A sight that would normally be funny. Well, to Luffy it was, so he did what he always did when things were funny. He started laughing. Nami then took off, trying to escape. Well guys, it was nice being in the crew, but now I'm leaving before I'm killed. She said, but couldn't do that because the otter stopped her in her tracks with freshly made pictures of her as well as Zoro and Luffy. Wow, very nice. She said while clapping and the otter bowed dramatically in gratitude. Then she turned back and regained her crying shark expression, which she must have picked up from Arlong somewhere in the past, or something. Now I can't even escape. She yelled at Vivi, who tried to comfort her by offering her meager, compared to the price demanded, savings. Then she turned to Luffy and Zoro. Why aren't you guys worried? She asked in a disbelieving tone as the two of them remained seated and were talking excitedly about the Shichibukai. Zoro snorted. This guy, he said and pointed at Luffy. Dual Dracul Mihikat Barady and they were pretty evenly matched. He what? Both of the girls shouted. Luffy scratched his head in embarrassment. Aki held back and was only defending against me. He said. The girls gaped at them in disbelief. Hockey. All three of his friends thought. Don't say that. I totally lost to him only using the knife. Even if he did hold back and never attack, you still forced him to take you very seriously. Zoro told him. Then he looked at Nami's gawking expression. Princess girl, I get why you're surprised, but why you Nami? Didn't anyone tell you? Zoro asked. She shook her head. Yosh. Luffy announced and stood up, raising both hands in the air. Let's go kick the crap out of Crocodile. A few minutes, an explosion, a little crying and Nakama dragging later. It's very good that you've managed to get away from your pursuers, a soft melodic voice commented. Luffy smirked but kept quiet. It sure is. Nami answered. Watch out for the shallows so you don't damage the hull. The voice said again. You can count on me for that. The same person replied. Was that you, Luffy? Luffy's sweat dropped. True, I don't have an incredibly manly voice, but I don't sound like that. Luffy thought but didn't voice it. He looked at her. Nice ship. The voice commented again. Everyone turned around. Sitting on the railing of the ship was none other than Yonkou Robin, wearing a cowboy hat, purple boots and an overall very revealing outfit, complete with a very short purple skirt, as well as also very short purple vest. Wow, evil Robin is very easy on the eyes. Luffy thought. The woman seemed to look at everyone individually, but her gaze rested on Luffy for the longest time, first at his scar and then at his face. She was studying his expression. He seems completely unsurprised by my intrusion. Like he's been expecting me. She thought. Her gaze then left Luffy and reached the Princess of Arabasta. I saw Mr. 8 not too long ago, Mrs. Wednesday. Robin told her. This of course caused Vivi to become enraged. You killed Igaram. She shouted in anger. Luffy then took a step forward. He didn't want to do that, but he was forced to act at least somewhat angry at her to not arouse any suspicion. Even if you did, why are you on the ship? He shouted. He hoped it was convincing enough. He knew Robin would be by far the hardest to keep things from. Why are you here? What are you doing here, Miss Alcindé? Vivi asked in a panicked tone. Miss Alcindé? Whose partner is that? Nami asked. Crocodiles. Luffy answered for Vivi. Aren't you? He asked, looking up to her. She looked a bit surprised, but then she smirked. Everyone else also looked at him, confused at how he would know. And just how did you know that, Captain? She asked, putting emphasis on the last word. It was very weird for him to hear her refer to him like that, at least without adding sen at the end. Your aura told me that. Your aura fits only a person in a position of power. Like to the partner of the boss. Luffy said and smirked. She looked at him with a somewhat surprised expression. Also, he continued. Your bounty is very high. He could see her facade of indifference and amusement falter for just a moment, replaced by a look of shock, but then she quickly regained it and smirked back. I see. She replied. Now, what are you doing here? He asked in a bit more hostile tone. And how do you know of her, Vivi? We shadowed her in order to determine the name of the boss. Vivi replied. Robin giggled softly. Correction, Miss Wednesday, I let you shadow me. She told her. So you're a good guy? Luffy asked. Nami punched him in the head, which didn't do anything, but whatever. She's a girl, Luffy. She told him. I know that. He pouted, but inwardly, his sweat dropped. Calling her a good girl sounds even worse but fine. Have it your way, Nami. I knew that. So you were also the one who told him his identity was exposed. Correct. So, she's a bad girl. Luffy announced. Nami seemed to have realized at how this sounded judging by her expression. Robin looked at Luffy with a somewhat wide-eyed expression. You shouldn't call me that. It sounds wrong. She told him without changing her tone. Vivi seemed irritated by her shift of attention. I know. Luffy replied and pointed to his female crew member. But Nami told me to. Robin looked at her with an unamused expression. You sure have weird thoughts. She told her and Nami flinched under her gaze, but then Robin's attention shifted back on the now glaring Vivi. What exactly are your intentions here? She asked her. Who knows, Robin answered and closed her eyes. But you're also serious about it. I just had to cooperate. A princess who actually thinks she can make an enemy of Baroque works and not only expects to survive but also save her country. It's just so ridiculous. Those words were the last straw for Vivi. She roared in anger and in response everyone who had a weapon pointed it at Robin. Zoro unsheathed two of his swords, Nami took her staff into her hands. Usopp and Sanji pointed at her head with a slingshot and a pistol respectively. Luffy made no move. Would you mind not pointing such dangerous things at me? She told them and Luffy saw a hand appear out of everyone that was armed and slap their weapons out of their hands. The hands disappeared almost immediately afterward. The others were confused and shocked. They correctly assumed that it was a devil fruit though. Sanji commented on Robin's beauty. He's right. Luffy thought and then looked at each of the girls. I'm so lucky. All three of my female nakama are beautiful. Then he gained a thoughtful expression. Come to think of it, we don't really have any bad-looking nakama. Well, Brook is a skeleton, but he makes it look great. Really, don't be in such a rush. Robin said and startled him from his thoughts. I'm not under any orders at the moment. I have no reason to fight you at the moment. Then she used her devil fruit powers to snatch his hat. Luffy gritted his teeth in irritation. She may be his future nakama, but right now she was an enemy, so he didn't like her just taking the hat. She looked at his hat and then back at him. "So you're the famous Straw Hat Captain, huh?" she asked. "Monkey D. Luffy." She continued, putting emphasis on the middle name. Luffy never fully understood the significance of D. He knew the people who carried the initial often became very important in an era. Monkey D. Garp, Monkey D. Dragon, Portgas D. Ace, Gold D. Roger, Marshall D. Teach as well as himself were all highly important, worldwide renowned figures whose actions and words influenced and changed everything in the world, the kind of change that even other, non-D, renowned people could only dream of doing. Roger, Garp, Ace and Teach all changed the world in their own way, and Dragon and Luffy were about to, although Luffy personally thought, maybe out of his pride or maybe out of a better reason, that the changes they caused would be nothing compared to what him and his father would do, especially together. He glared at her as she put his hat on top of her own hat. "But bad luck," she commented. "You pirates picking up a princess that Baroque Works wants dead. And even though the princess is protected by a very powerful pirate, your chances with Mr. Zero aren't exactly high. But the worst is your next destination." Nami looked at her in surprise and then looked at her log pose. "The next island is Little Garden." Robin continued with a smirk. "My dear Sanji's eye turned into a heart upon hearing this, even if we do absolutely nothing, you won't make it to your little kingdom, princess." Said princess gritted her teeth. "Isn't all that really foolish?" The Baroque Work second in command asked, but then threw them two objects. Hat to Luffy and an eternal pose to Arabasta to Vivi. "I'm curious though," she said and looked at Luffy. "Why didn't you point anything at me?" Luffy then smirked and to her horror and the surprise of everyone on board, Robin noticed in his hands both her hat as well as the eternal pose. Nobody had seen him even move. Luffy looked at her hat for a moment and then put it on top of his. "It's simple. You were a good girl and kept your hands mostly to yourself. If you were a bad girl you wouldn't be leaving this ship in a very good state," Luffy told her in a casual tone. It was the simple admission that scared her. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement. He threw her back the hat and she caught her and regained her composure somewhat. "As for this," he said, looking at the eternal pose resting on his palm. "I don't need it. I want to see both Little Garden and Drum." Then the eternal pose seemed to spontaneously shatter into pieces. "So this is Little Garden, eh?" Sanji asked as the ship sailed further along the river leading into the center of the island. "There's nothing little about it," Nami commented with a wide-eyed expression as she eyed the giant trees and giant plants, as well as giant birds on the island. Flashback. "Ejujajujaju, what fun humans. Ibabababa. Let's help them out, Dory." "Okay, Broggy." Luffy sighed. "I need to kick the crap out of 3. He's going to be a real jerk today," he thought. "We need some supplies," Sanji announced. "I wonder if we can get them here." Luffy's lower lip twitched. "I wonder if there's a meat restaurant here," Luffy asked himself aloud. Nami face-palmed and Zoro groaned in annoyance. "What the hell would one be doing here?" Sanji yelled at Luffy. He shrugged. "But you said we need supplies." Luffy whined. Sanji sighed. "I meant we need ingredients, shitty Gomu," he said in an annoyed tone. "I have no idea what goes on in your tiny brain." "That's mean," Luffy whined. And he meant it. "Honestly, Sanji was always too mean to me." Then Nami commented on the plants on the island. "Pra. A bird called somewhere near." Nami covered her ears. Sanji noticed this. "So cute," he commented with a weird perverted expression. Usopp turned around, also covering his ears. "You mean me?" he asked while using the sure kill Captain Usopp cute expression. "Of course not, shithead." Sanji yelled at him, irritated. Luffy however was looking at Vivi and Karu, who were doing the same thing. "What about them?" he said and pointed at them. Sanji got a heart in his eye and started swirling around. "Of course beautiful Vivi-chan is also cute," he told her in his love noodle state. Then he looked at Karu. "And emergency food over there is also cute." Karu flinched and sweated. Vivi wasn't pleased by this. "Don't talk about Karu like that, Sanji-san," she asked. "Hi, Vivi-chan." Then the bird descended above Sanji and everybody pointed above his head. Sanji of course didn't know what was going on. "Hey, what are you so nervous about?" he asked. "It's just a little bird." The bird descended upon them and tried to grab Sanji, but "Gomu Gomu no pistol," Luffy announced and punched the bird away into the distance. Vivi and Karu wide-eyed at the display, while the rest of them didn't really react that surprised, except Sanji, who thanked Luffy and muttered a curse under his breath, something about shitty oversized birds. Luffy giggled happily and the rest looked at him in horror. "This island is so cool." Luffy beamed. "Sanji, make lunchboxes. I'm going on an adventure." "Adventure," Nami and Usopp screamed. Luffy nodded. "Adventure," he yelled, raising his hands high in the air. "I wonder," Vivi asked and everyone looked at her. "Could I also come?" "Yosh. Come with me, Vivi. I'll protect you." Luffy announced. After a few hours and fighting giant dinosaurs and getting eaten by one. You're huge. Luffy beamed. He stood on the palm of the giant, Dory. The huge man wore a bronze helmet on his head, a blue cloak, some kind of waistband, green pants and brown shoes. He also had beaten-looking shield and sword. He had a very long brown beard. Ijaja, I was watching you. You played with the long necks in the forest. What a lively human. And strong too. You smacked them around pretty good before you got eaten. Dory commented in a bright mood. Are you a giant? Luffy asked, although he already knew the answer. Ijaja I am. He replied cheerfully. I'm the mightiest warrior of Elbaf. Dory. Luffy was glad to see the giant boss again. He and his friend Broggy were always the kind of fighters Luffy, but especially his crew member Usopp looked up to. I'm Luffy. He introduced himself. I'm a pirate. The giant looked at him for a moment. Ijaja, that's great. He announced. I'm also a pirate. I was once very famous. He sensed that Dory was a great deal stronger than the giant he defeated at Marineford, as well as Oimo and Kashi. Luffy, to his amusement, saw in the corner of his eye the panicked face of Vivi and the catatonic Karu on the ground. He turned into their direction and pointed at them. Dory, those are Vivi and Karu and they are my friends. He announced. Vivi shook scared as the giant proceeded to pick them up. Let me take you to my place, you guys. The giant announced and took them. A few minutes later. Dory and Luffy laughed heartily while they ate. Vivi and Karu also ate somewhere in the background. Hey, that's great. Luffy beamed while sitting on a giant piece of half-eaten meat. Of course. Jajajajaja. And your little lunchbox is also good. Dory replied. Though it was much too small. You bet. Luffy told him. This was a pirate lunchbox made by my cook. If you said it was bad, I'd have to kick your ass. Kick my ass? The giant asked and Vivi and Karu spat out their drink, but Dory didn't think anything bad of it. What a funny little human. They're so friendly with each other. Vivi commented in shock. Giant Asen, your sword looks very beaten up. Luffy said and pointed to his weapon. Dory looked at it and then took it in his hands. Jajajaja. You're right. But it survived for so many years. I've had it ever since our feud started. Dory commented. Well, you see, there's a rule on Elbaf. Dory started. If you start a duel with another giant, you must leave Elbaf. And then the god of Elbaf decides who is supposed to return. I've started a feud with another giant who is also on this island. Until one of us dies in an honorable duel, we can't leave. Only one may return. Wow. Luffy beamed. And what was your feud about? The giant stopped and thought for a while. You see, I can't remember. It's been 100 years already. Not even Broggy remembers and he has better memory. Dory explained. 100 years Vivi stuttered. Dory looked at her. Yes. Surprised. We giants live 3 times longer than you pipsqueaks. He answered. Cool. Luffy beamed. Then the volcano erupted. Dory stood up and Luffy could hear another giant doing the same in the distance. I don't remember when we decided that way, but this our signal. Dory announced pointing to the volcano. Fight well. Luffy yelled in encouragement. Ijajajaja. Of course. An hour or so later, after the fight. Dory sat down and rested. Luffy, who was watching the battle, complimented him. The giant laughed in appreciation. Then Vivi remembered something. Dory-san. She asked. Is it true that the log pose takes a whole year to set on this island? Dory's expression turned a bit more serious. Didn't you guys notice all those puny human bones over there? Dory asked. Vivi's expression turned into one of shock. It seems a year on this island is too much for humans. Most wind up dying before the log pose sets. I don't know why. Flashback. Nami came from her cabin with a totally red face. We have to get to Arabasta. She announced. No, Nami-san, we have to get you to a doctor. Vivi told her. That's right, Nami-swan. Sanji confirmed. Girl, if you had arrived even one day later, I probably wouldn't have able to save you. You're immensely lucky. Luffy's eyes widened in horror. But, if you're meant to live on, then you'll be able to leave. One can always get lucky. Dory continued. That's right. We were lucky and we'll be lucky again. Luffy thought and calmed down. I guess you're right. Luffy commented and then they laughed together. Then Dory put the empty barrel on the ground and reached for a new one. Luffy then realized something. Flashback. How dare you do this? Interrupt a sacred duel like this? Don't think you'll get away with this, humans. No, wait, Dory. Luffy yelled, surprising the 3 that were with him. Dory dropped the barrel back on the ground. What is it? The giant asked confused. You gave me this to drink, didn't you? I know, Luffy said and sighed. But there's something wrong with that barrel. Luffy lied. It was a white lie. There was nothing really outstandingly different about the barrel, but Luffy needed to stop Dory from drinking it. "Something's wrong?" Dory asked in bewilderment. Luffy nodded and walked up to the barrel. He checked over the barrel. Dory hadn't opened it yet, so Luffy did. Luffy didn't really expect that. The barrel was surprisingly easy to open, meaning it was opened a short time ago and wasn't closed tightly enough. "Someone did something," Luffy announced. All three looked at him, still confused. "What?" the giant asked. Luffy took a sake glass from the ground where he set it when the giants went to battle. He filled the cup and smelled the sake. There was now no doubt. "It's poisoned," Luffy told them. They all stared at him. "Who would do something like that?" Vivi asked as she covered her mouth in shock. Luffy shook his head. "Nobody on the crew. I trust those guys," Luffy replied honestly. "But I've sensed a few people skulking around on the island. It must have been them." He turned to Dory. "Do you and your friend have a bounty?" he asked. Dory eyed him for a moment but then nodded. "I don't know if it's still active, but we each had 100 million on our head," he replied. Luffy nodded. "They tried to ruin the duel by weakening you. Then, when you lost, they'd try to kill Broggy themselves," Luffy told him. Dory stood up abruptly. "They tried to ruin a sacred duel?" he roared. Then, right at that moment, the volcano erupted again. "I hate to ask, my friends, but could you?" Dory started. "Sure, Dory, I'll make sure nobody interrupts." Luffy interrupted Dory's words. "Fight well." A few minutes later at the dueling spot. "Dory, so we fight again." "Gabababa." "Broggy," the other giant announced. He had an axe and a shield. He wore a Viking helmet on his head. He had a brown shirt, pants and shoes as well as a belt and a blue cloak, same as Dory. Said giant then put his hand close to a nearby mountain. "Babababa. Why did you bring the tiny human here?" Broggy asked. "To watch the fight." Dory grunted in confirmation. "Gijajagya. Broggy. Someone is trying to influence the fight. They poisoned one of his sake barrels," Dory told him. Luffy could see that Broggy was angered by this. So he offered to watch the fight. "How dare they try that?" Broggy roared. "I want to find them and squash them, but we must fight, my friend." And then, they fought. Dory struck first and brought his sword upon Broggy, but his blow was blocked. Then he retracted his sword and Broggy struck, a blow which Dory also blocked. At almost the same time, Dory struck again and his blow was blocked again. Then, they retracted their weapons at the same time and struck each other, this time blocking each other from victory with their weapons. This proceeded for some time then, and then Luffy sensed something. "Three," he thought to himself. "Finally you show your face." He jumped off the mountain, activating his Soru, and proceeded to intercept the incoming attack. But it was wax. Luffy tried to punch it away, but it wouldn't work that way. Instead, the wax surrounded him. "This is still fine," Luffy thought as he was being covered in wax. "I still prevented him from interfering." Then Mr. 3 stepped out of the forest. "Mujiwara," he said in an annoyed tone. "Why did you have to interfere?" Luffy was then completely covered in wax and the wax hardened. "No matter," Galdino announced with a huff. "I've got your Nakama and you can do nothing when trapped in my wax." True to his word, Luffy could feel his Nakama nearby and too familiar weak to him or is near them. He must have used his wax to trap their legs. He thought. He couldn't possibly have got Zoro otherwise. Flashback. In Impel Down, Galdino, Mr. 3, and Buggy accidentally ran into Crocodile. "What do you think you're doing, Croco?" "CCC Crow Crocodile." "BBBBO boss." "Ah, Mr. 3. What is trash like you doing here?" Hansen Sanji though. They didn't get him. He thought. Then he heard a few thuds. Mr. 5 and Mrs. Valentine must have thrown his friends on the floor. "Well, you tried well enough, Straw Hats, but a superior criminal wins his battle before it has even begun." Ho 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 ho. Is that so? Luffy thought. He activated his hockey and the wax blackened and started to crack. Luffy noticed that Galdino's laugh abruptly stopped. Then the wax around him shattered and as he emerged, he looked at the gaping expressions. "Hi." He greeted to them and waved his hand. Then he turned around and looked at the giants. They were still fighting. "Good. Luffy." His Nakama finally cried out all at once. He walked towards them to free them, but suddenly, he couldn't move anymore. "I don't feel like freeing you," he told them. They gaped at him like he grew 3 heads, which to be fair was quite understandable in this situation. "What is this?" he thought to himself. "Why can't I move? Why did I say that?" He looked to the ground. He couldn't speak, but apparently, he could still move a little bit. His eyes widened in horror. The girl 3's partner. "I was way too careless today. But why didn't I sense her?" "Luffy, don't joke around," Nami yelled. "You've got to free us." Zoro, however, was looking at the ground underneath Luffy. "I don't think he can." Look at that. He said and pointed at the painted circular symbol underneath Luffy. Oh ho ho ho. You freed yourself, Mugiwara, but even you can't do anything against Miss Gildenweek's hypnotic ability. Your 70.000.000 bounty is as good as mine. Luffy glanced to his right, where said girl stood, munching on an apple. Can't do anything? He thought. Let's see about that. He tried to use his Conqueror's Haki, but it wouldn't work, and Luffy was absolutely sure he could have knocked her out, together with her accomplices. He tried to use Observation Haki, but it also wouldn't work. Last he tried Armament. Armament, he thought, and as it was supposed to, his arm became shiny black. His eyes widened again, this time out of confusion. Why does Armament work, but Observation and Intimidation don't? Then he got a look of realization. This kid's power, it prevents the usage of Haki outside the circle. He thought. But it can't be intentional. 3 didn't know Haki, so she sure as hell doesn't. He looked at his Nakama in panic. There was nothing he could do right now. Galdino laughed some more as he saw his desperate fate. Flashback. Sanji's body fell on the ground, lifeless, just as Luffy ran onto the deck. He was completely charred. His cigarette fell on the floor. Akainu stood over him. He was the one who dealt the final blow. Akainu looked at him and smirked. You were too weak, Mugiwara. Luffy got more and more desperate and he turned his head around and around, desperate to find some hope. No, there's no way I'm losing my crew to 3 of all people. Galdino laughed louder. Then he heard something. He turned his head upwards and looked at the tree. Balls Oro, Vivi and Nami lied on the ground, restrained by the wax. Usopp apparently climbed on top of the tree. He probably intended to rain gunpowder stars upon them. Luffy didn't know how the marksman managed to avoid getting taken, but he was glad he did. Luffy noticed Usopp. Their eyes met. He motioned with his eyes for Usopp to target the girl. Usopp's eyes widened. He understood. Luffy smiled. Sure kill surprise Usopp gunpowder star. Usopp thought and pulled his slingshot and fired. Luffy could finally move again. Galdino's laugh stopped and he looked in absolute horror as Luffy roared. Thanks Usopp. You saved us all. Luffy yelled and ran towards Mr. 3. Armament. Luffy murmured and his right arm became shiny black. He pulled his arm backward. That's shit. Galdino yelled. Candle wall. Gomu Gomu no bullet. Luffy announced and punched forward. MR.3 seconds wall was of no help at all. The attack crushed through it like it was paper, not hard as steel wax. The offending officer agent flew through several trees before he finally hit a mountain and stopped. He embedded himself into it. Usopp fell down from the destroyed tree and crashed into the ground. Then he stood up. Hey, why didn't you help the falling hero? He complained and touched a bump on his head. Sorry. Luffy apologized, for once sincerely. But you're right. You are a hero. Usopp raised his chest proudly. Now, as for you, Luffy announced and turned around and faced his remaining opponents. Mr. 5 and Miss Valentine started backing away in fear. Gomu Gomu no, they screamed and started running away in panic. Twin pistol. A few minutes later. Sanji strolled casually to where the Straw Hats and the Giants were seated. Nami Swan. Vivi Chuan. He shouted in his love-induced state. And the rest of you idiots. Where were you? Usopp, Zoro as well as Karu, although not in words, shouted at him. Boy, Sanji. Luffy greeted. Oh, I was just having a talk with Mr. Zero. Sanji announced to them, shutting them up. And I got us this. In his hand was the eternal pose to Arabasta. Luffy was on the figurehead of the Going Merry and he looked into the sea. He thought about what happened back on Little Garden. Damn. I messed up. He thought, but then someone put a hand on his shoulder. Oh, Zoro. Luffy greeted. What is it? Boy, Luffy, you're still dwelling on what happened. He asked in a quiet tone. Luffy sighed. I screwed up. He said simply. We're still alive. Don't dwell on the past. Zoro told him. Then he laughed. And Usopp got a confidence boast. Luffy then laughed as well. I guess it was good for the least. He agreed. Did you want anything else? He asked Zoro as he noticed that he still lingered near the figurehead. Zoro sighed. Yes, actually. Could you help me with my training? He asked. Luffy turned around in surprise. How? He asked. By sparring. Was the answer. Luffy looked at him. But Sanji is closer to you in strength. You could spar with him. He told him. Zoro shook his head. Nah, the cook is fawning over the women and he's not a swordsman anyway. He told him. Are you saying I'm a swordsman? Luffy asked him. Zoro's eye twitched. Just spar with me. He yelled. I need to get better. Okay. Luffy replied and stood up. They walked up to the deck and took positions, facing each other. Luffy unsheathed his sword and Zoro unsheathed 2 of his. Not going to use that one? Luffy asked and pointed at the white katana. Zoro shook his head. I need to get used to these two troublemakers. Zoro told him and lifted his two katanas slightly. Yubashiri is lighter than most katanas and Sandai Kitetsu is way too bloodthirsty. Yeah, I noticed. Luffy said. Zoro looked at him weirdly. The bounty hunter town. Luffy told him and he nodded. Then they clashed. Zoro attacked. Luffy blocked the swords and then Zoro retracted one of them and attempted to cut Luffy, who pushed Zoro's first sword away with his own and dodged the slash by pulling his body slightly backward. Then he moved forward and attacked and Zoro stopped his attempt with both of his swords. Zoro then pushed Luffy back slightly and retracted Kitetsu and attempted again to slash Luffy, who avoided getting cut by jumping back. Then Zoro attempted to execute an attack similar to Santoryu Onigiri, though without the sword in his mouth, but Luffy stopped both of his swords in the middle with his own before he could do any damage. As they fought, everyone came on the deck to watch the fight. "Why are you fighting?" Vivi asked a little scared. They did fight with real weapons so she assumed they had a problem. "We're sparring," Zoro said as he threw another attack, which Luffy parried. "With real weapons?" Vivi asked shocked. Karu cried out something, presumably something similar. Luffy tried to slash Zoro, but his sword was blocked and he was pushed a little back. Zoro then unleashed a series of attacks with both his swords, which were then either blocked or avoided. "We're not going to kill each other," Luffy told her. "Besides, when has a small cut ever killed anyone?" "What about a big one?" Usopp yelled at them and nearly slapped them. Sanji lighted himself a cigarette. "I'm just glad Zoro is getting his butt kicked," he commented. Zoro gained a twitch on his forehead as he dashed ahead toward Luffy. "I'd like to see you do better, stupid cook," he huffed as his swords were again blocked. "Zoro's right," Luffy said as he proceeded to attack his sparring partner multiple times, which he blocked without too much trouble. Also, cuts work better against rubber than kicks. Zoro smirked and continued to attack in contentment while Sanji gritted his teeth angrily. He attacked Luffy again, but this time when Luffy blocked one of his blades, he didn't dodge the second, but to everyone's surprise blocked the blade with his blackened arm. "What?" yelled everyone together. Luffy simply pushed both of his swords away and then showed his tongue. "Shishishi, did you expect that to cut me?" he asked them as they gaped at him. "Luffy, you can block swords with your hands?" Zoro asked in a disbelieving tone. Luffy nodded. "Armament haki sure is useful," he stated and grinned. Zoro sighed. "Luffy, why do you even carry a sword, then?" he asked him. "You're much better with your fists and if you can block swords you don't really need it." Luffy gained a thoughtful expression as he scratched his head. "Don't know," he said. "Cutting ships is kinda funny. Also, Shanks said that a pirate is cooler with a sword." Everyone deadpanned. Except Vivi and Karu. Wait, cutting ships?" Vivi asked. "Yeah." Nami spoke in an uncharacteristically soft tone. "This idiot can cut ships in half." This got the attention of everyone. "Topper, here we come," thought Luffy as he finally sheathed his sword and made his way to her. "Nami-san, are you okay?" Sanji asked. "I'm just feeling a bit tired." She tried to lie, but even if they couldn't see through the lie, they noticed her red face. Luffy touched her forehead and after a moment pulled his hand away. "You're burning up," he told her. Then he looked her in the eyes. "Could you pull your shirt up for a moment, Nami?" he asked her. "Why?" she yelled, but her tone lacked its usual harshness. "Just do it," he told her again. Sanji was about to yell at Luffy, but Vivi stopped him. Nami finally complied. On her stomach was a very nasty looking purple mark. Luffy poked it slightly and she flinched in pain. He stood up. "Did you get it in the jungle?" he asked her. Flashback. "Ouch!" Nami shouted. "What's wrong?" Zoro asked her. "Nothing, just a bug bite." She nodded. "We need to find Drum Island right now. It's supposed to be on the route to Arabasta," Luffy told them in a commanding tone. "Why, what's wrong with Nami-san?" Vivi asked in a shocked tone. "Shanks told me about this," Luffy lied. "We need to get to Drum as fast as we can." "Why?" asked Usopp. Luffy sighed. "If we don't find her help," Luffy begun. Everyone gulped. "She'll die." A few hours later. After a bit of arguing after Luffy's revelation, where Nami tried to convince everyone that getting to Arabasta was more important, but Vivi wouldn't take it, even after learning about everything bad that's happened in her homeland, they sailed towards Drum. During the way, they were ambushed by Wapol and his soldiers. Luffy and most of his crew stood on the deck of the ship. They were surrounded by hostile soldiers who were aiming their rifles at them. Wapol came down from the ship, eating a piece of meat and a knife. He was fat and had dark purple hair and a metallic jaw. He wore plate armor and a large hooded overcoat made from an animal fur. He asked them if they had an eternal pose to Drum, which they denied, after which he told them he was going to take any treasure or supplies they have on board. He then proceeded to eat a part of the ship and was sent flying. A few more hours later. The Going Merry entered Drum territory but was ambushed by the villagers who were exceptionally hostile to them. Even when they did nothing, they fired at them, nearly hitting Sanji twice and Vivi once, the latter of which was blocked by Luffy. Vivi, having learned that sometimes it was better to show piety and bow their head than to proceed with violence, bowed her head and begged them to let them on the island. Luffy followed her example and soon after everyone else followed his. After letting them on the island, Dalton, their unofficial leader, took them to his house, where they talked. First he told them about the doctor and her usual visits. Then Dalton mentioned the recent raid by a group of pirates, the reason for the people's hostile behavior. Blackbeard. Luffy muttered and clenched his fist, unknowingly turning it black. This caught the attention of his crew, who knew that that didn't happen unless Luffy was considerably angry, as well as Dalton, who stared in shock at his arm. He too, however, got to the same conclusion. "You know that pirate?" he asked him. Luffy nodded. "He was my brother's Nakama, but if he did this, then he must have betrayed them." Luffy told him. He already knew that had happened. Thatch was dead and Ace and maybe Sabo too were coming to get him. "They're brothers?" Dalton asked. Luffy nodded again. "My older brothers are part of the Whitebeard pirates under Yonkou Edward Newgate," Luffy answered. He was met with shocked stares. "Sabo or Blue Gentleman Sabo has a bounty of 380 million berry," Luffy told them, and they gaped like fishes. 380 million berry? Usopp yelled. Luffy smirked. "My other brother has an even higher bounty," he continued. Their jaws dropped. "The even higher," Vivi stuttered. Luffy nodded. "His name is Ace or Fire Fist Ace. He has a bounty of 550 million berry." He finished and looked at their astonished faces. "I wonder how they would react if I also told them who my father, Grandpa and the one who gave me the hat are." Luffy thought and suppressed a chuckle. "Though Zoro already knows about Gramps, but he isn't here." "Blue Gentleman and Fire Fist," Sanji said in a soft voice. "Total bounty of 930 million berry," Usopp continued. "Combined with yours, that's 1 billion berry," Vivi finished. "What?" all three yelled together. Dalton looked as pale as a wall. Luffy waved his hand in dismissal as he continued. "Anyway, Blackbeard was one of them. He's not as strong as me or his former captain, but he's a formidable pirate," he told them. Then he turned to Dalton. "If a pirate of that caliber decides to invade, there's not much defense against him," he told him. "You were lucky that we didn't decide to act on your hostility. Sanji and Zoro are more than enough for a small army, and that's without including me." Dalton nodded, shaken a bit by his words. "Now, I really must take Nami to the doctor." "Where is that witch?" he asked. Dalton flinched at the last word. "Why, you really shouldn't call her that," Dalton told him. "Listen, she's..." After more hours of running, saving Sanji from getting stomped on, avoiding shitty giant rabbits and Wapple, which was thankfully much easier with Soru, and mountain climbing, which was, again, much easier with armament protecting his hands. Luffy woke up. Upon coming on top of the mountain, he was pretty exhausted and after being ensured that his Nakama were going to be fine, he dozed off right there in the snow. He opened his eyes. And there was Chopper. Flashback. Chopper's charred body lay on top of a few marine bodies in the men's quarters. The eyes that were usually so full of life and joy and curiosity were now empty. He quickly hid as Luffy sat up in bed, well the wrong way, but anyway, he hid behind the doorframe. Luffy smiled. The reindeer approached him cautiously. "You're awake." He spoke. "You can talk," Luffy said. "You're a monster." Chopper's face fell and he looked down, probably having been called that for the 1000th time. When the boy in the straw hat smiled at him, he thought that this time was going to be different. And now, he called him a monster. "Just like me," Luffy said. Chopper's eyes widened in surprise and he looked at him. "Look." Luffy told him and started to stretch his body in all possible ways. Chopper looked at him weirdly and then started to laugh. Luffy then smiled and leaned a bit forward. Chopper flinched and hid again. "What's your name?" he asked. The reindeer stepped forward again. "It's Tony Chopper," he told him. "I'm Monkey D. Luffy, the other man here is Sanji, and the girl we carried is Nami. How is she by the way?" "She's going to be fine," Chopper told him. "But Doctorine told me that the blasted girl was walking around naked on a prehistoric island." Luffy looked at him for a moment and Chopper nearly panicked, thinking Luffy would be mad. To his surprise, Luffy laughed. "Hee, it seems you're getting along well, Chopper," a voice said. Luffy looked in the direction of the voice and noticed the body of a young woman, but then as he looked up, he noticed the head of an old woman with sunglasses. He blinked a few times. "So my memory wasn't wrong. So you're Doctorine?" he asked. She nodded. "Hee, I am," Dr. Kariha answered. "You were pretty reckless to climb a mountain on your own, carrying 2 of your Nakama," she told him. But if you had waited much longer, she would have died, so good job. Luffy nodded. By the way, she asked. You got up here pretty much undamaged. By all logic, your fingers should be completely messed up and you should have been half frozen, but you were only exhausted. Why is that? Chopper looked up to him in interest. I was also wondering about that. He told him. Luffy looked at them. Ah, that would be my haki. He said. Haki can protect your body if you master it. Watch this. He pushed his right hand in the air and clenched his fist. Armament. He muttered and his fist became shiny black. They both looked at him in surprise. Cool, Chopper beamed. Luffy smiled. This was the Chopper he knew. Doctorine, however, stepped forward and grabbed his arm and looked at it closer. I've heard about this. She muttered and after a few moments she released it. Luffy unclenched it and stopped the armament. We also came here because we need a doctor on our pirate ship. He said. He looked at Doctorine. She smiled and nodded after motioning her eyes at Chopper. Pirates, Chopper yelled. Pirates are scum. The Chopper's surprise, Luffy nodded. Yes, most are. But some of us sail to be free and have adventures. He told him. Adventures? Chopper repeated. Luffy nodded, but then Chopper's eyes suddenly widened in horror. What is it? Doctorine asked. It's Wapol. He told her. I smell Wapol. He's here. After a few minutes, at the entrance. Dr. Kariha. What have you done with my castle? Why is there a pirate flag there? Wapol asked as Luffy, Chopper and Doctorine stepped from the building. Sanji woke up, but Luffy told him to protect Nami, although he really meant him not to kill himself by fighting outside. It isn't your castle anymore, Wapol. Just leave. Dr. Kariha told him. He scowled in anger. I'm going to destroy that damn flag. Wapol announced. Somehow, using the abilities of his Baku Baku no Mi, he spawned a cannon from his body and fired. Luffy activated his Soru and jumped towards the flag. As the cannonball neared him, Luffy muttered his usual word. The cannonball crashed into his chest. Wapol laughed as the smoke cleared, but as it did his laugh abruptly stopped. Kariha and Chopper then noticed that Luffy wasn't near them. Where did he go? They thought to themselves. Mugiwara. Wapol yelled in anger. Why did you protect that flag? The doctor duo looked up and noticed a completely undamaged flag, as well as a completely undamaged Luffy in front of it. When did he get there? Chopper thought. Wapol then fired again, gaining the same result. You can't destroy this flag, Big Mouth. Luffy announced. Big Mouth, Chopper thought with wide eyes. I don't know what this flag stands for, but I know what every pirate stands for. It's a symbol of conviction. Luffy told him. Then he activated his Soru again and to the surprise and horror of everyone present, he seemed to reappear right in front of Wapol and he pushed him into the snow. Said man muttered curses under his breath as he tried to free himself. Of course, his two ministers tried to help him, but Chopper intercepted them and Luffy watched in joy as the reindeer showed almost all of his transformed forms again, except Monster Point, and used them to beat the crap out of them. You're so cool. Luffy yelled with stars in his eyes. Moron. Praising me won't make me happy at all, stupid idiot. Chopper muttered as he danced his awkward little dance. Luffy then released a fuming Wapol, who took a step back. Listen, Mugiwara. He told Luffy in an angry but controlled tone. I'm the king of this island. You have no right to do this to me. Really, Luffy asked in a childish. But I've decided you won't be king anymore, Big Mouth. What? Wapol asked in an irritated voice. A few hours ago, I've claimed this island as my own. And you're not king anymore. Luffy told him. Flashback. What are those? Dalton asked as Luffy handed him something. Pirate flags. He looked at him in confusion. A symbol of the Straw Hat Pirates. Luffy told him. Dalton looked ready to say something. Wapol will return soon, as we've met him on the sea and he was headed here. Luffy told him. Dalton's eyes widened in shock. When he arrives, don't fight him. Just point him towards the castle and say someone has dared to claim it. He'll immediately come there and then I'll kick his ass. Dalton thought about it for a moment and then nodded. What about the flags? He asked after a while. Luffy looked back at him. After I've kicked his ass, you can hang those around. To signal that you're under my protection. If you want to. Luffy told him. I can't guarantee anything, but it should save you from at least common pirates and other king wannabes. You do that for us? Dalton asked in shock. Put us under your protection. Luffy nodded. Your country will save my navigator, so it's the least I can do. Now I have to leave and make sure that happens. Claimed? All three of the remaining people asked. Luffy nodded. You can't do that, Mugiwara. Listen. Drum Kingdom is a member kingdom of the world government. If you do this, the government will take action. Luffy laughed. I'm wanted for 70.000.000 Berry, Big Mouth. Don't care. He told him. 70.000.000, Barry. Both Chopper and Doctorine repeated in their minds. Now leave. Luffy ordered, but the fallen king wouldn't go that easily. He tried to punch Luffy, but he avoided. Then he pulled back his fist. Armament. He announced. Gomu Gomu no pistol. And that was that. A bit later, after everyone arrives. I just wanted to thank you. For all you've done for us today. Chopper said nervously. What are you saying? Come with us. Luffy told him. I can't. He told him. You're a human and I'm a monster reindeer and. Shut up. Luffy interrupted, raising hands in the sky. Let's go. Chopper couldn't help but cry uncontrollably. Only this time, the tears were tears of joy. He has found his nakama. Something crashed. Why you jerk? Someone yelled from the men's quarters. The rest of the crew was on the deck except Sanji, who was cooking, and Luffy, who was in the men's quarters, and Chopper, who went to get him. Chopper came running out of the room and he was crying. Vivi, Usopp and Nami, who were on deck, noticed this. Zoro was on watch duty. What happened, Chopper? Usopp asked a reindeer as he ran towards him and hid behind his leg. Nami and Vivi also looked at him surprised. Zoro also noticed this from the top of the ship and watched. Luffy. Chopper stuttered. I went to wake him to play with us. He hiccuped. And then he threw that stone he's got at me and yelled. Chopper finished. I thought Luffy was nice. Hick. Usopp's eyes widened in realization. Flashback. Would you just shut up? I didn't have any freaking sleep in 2 days and now I have to listen to this stupid crap. Just shut the hell up and go back to your stupid ship, Don Klinger, whatever the hell your name is, jerk. So who did you piss off? I'm not in the mood for this. At lost, jerks. What are you jerks still doing here? Your job, jerks. Luffy-san did what Luffy yelled at you? Vivi and Nami both asked at the same time. That's right, they weren't there. Usopp thought. They don't know about it. Usopp took up his Captain Usopp stance. Yosh, Captain Usopp will now tell you what's going on. He announced. Nami face palmed at his stance, but Vivi and Chopper looked at him expectantly. He then sat on the ground. Luffy probably had nightmares again and couldn't sleep, so he's in a really bad mood today. Usopp told them. Really? Luffy has nightmares? Chopper asked. Luffy-san has nightmares? Vivi asked in a bewildered expression. But he is so strong. What could he have nightmares about? Truly, it boggles the mind how such a powerful man could be kept awake at night by bad dreams. Everyone nodded at her words. I'm not sure. He usually mutters in his sleep about meat, Usopp answered, and Nam face palmed. But often he trashes around, muttering names. What names? Nami asked. Ace, Sabo, Usopp began. But also our names. Also Robin and someone called Iva-chan sometimes. And a few others. Chopper nodded and wiped his tears. I heard him say Jinbei a few times. He told them. Who were Iva-chan, Robin and Jinbei? Nami asked in confusion. Nobody knew. Zoro on top, who listened to them, also furrowed his brows, trying to remember something, but got nothing. Then everyone heard the sound of someone walking in sandals. Luffy climbed up from the men's quarters and stomped towards the kitchen, completely ignoring his crew. True to Usopp's words, Luffy looked like he didn't sleep at all last night. He had black bags under his eyes and an annoyed expression on his face. He walked up to the kitchen door. Sanji, food. He demanded, but not in his usual cheerful tone. Sanji opened his mouth to yell at him, but then he noticed his expression. Shit, not again. He thought and flinched. Hi, Luffy. He answered in a nervous tone. He gave him a plate of snacks from the refrigerator. Eat that. But you'll have to wait until I'm finished cooking for more. Luffy nodded and walked away while eating the snacks. Everyone on the deck, except Chopper and Usopp, had shocked expressions on their faces. Hey, why is everyone so shocked? Chopper asked. Usopp looked at him. Did Sanji-kun just give Luffy a snack before lunch? Nami asked in disbelief. I know, right? Vivi confirmed. He usually kicks him into the master yells at him. Zoro sweated. Damn, Cook is almost like he's afraid of Luffy. Everyone turned to Usopp as he knew the most about this. What's going on, Usopp-san? Vivi finally asked. Yosh, Captain Usopp will now, he started. Will you just answer the damn question, Usopp? Nami interrupted with a twitch. Usopp sighed. Fine. He answered. When Luffy was in such a bad mood last, he yelled a lot the whole day, even at us. And he blew up at basically anything we said or did that irritated him. Honestly, he's scary without sleep. This happened before? Nami asked confused. Usopp nodded. The Bereti, the day Dawn Creek came. Usopp told her. Basically, just try not to piss him off. It'll be scary if you do. Everyone gulped. A few minutes later. Everyone gathered in the dining room. Luffy, surprisingly, wasn't there first, however he still arrived before the ladies. Sanji, however, because of Luffy's obvious foul mood, made an exception this time and let everyone in immediately. The meal was a bit awkward because everyone kept looking at Luffy and they weren't talking much to make sure not to upset him somehow. They even made sure not to prevent him from stealing their food. He didn't seem to care for the awkwardness and just kept eating. Then, in the middle of the meal. "Guys, I want to talk to you about something," Luffy announced. Everyone raised their heads and looked at him. "I have a feeling that we'll be meeting one or both of my brothers soon," Luffy continued. Everyone looked at him in surprise. "I think everyone here knows who they are, right?" Everyone nodded. Usopp, Vivi and Sanji told Zoro, Chopper and Nami while traveling. For some reason Zoro still hadn't told anyone who Luffy's grandpa was, but Luffy was fine with that. "I have something to ask you," Luffy continued. "Ace and Sabo don't know that I'm stronger than them and I'd like to keep it a secret for now." "But why?" Usopp asked. Luffy sighed. "I can't tell you that yet. But please promise me. Even if they say I'm weak, even if they brag about their strength, don't correct them," he told them. Everyone looked at him oddly, but then they nodded. "I don't get it, but we'll do as you say, Captain," Zoro answered for everyone. Luffy nodded. "Good. One more thing. Don't mention hockey at all. And if they join us in our travel, you'll stop your observation hockey training for that time," Luffy continued. "In fact, don't talk about hockey to anyone outside this crew." "What's the point of this, Luffy?" Nami asked. The weakling trio was actually relieved that they wouldn't have to train hockey if one of the brothers came aboard, but it was still strange. Luffy sighed again. "I can't tell you that. All I can say is that someday, you'll understand." Knowing they wouldn't get anything else out of Luffy regarding that topic, everyone continued eating. A few hours later. Since the crew had very little food left, they were very near Arabasta now, but still, the food was a problem. They were forced to resort to fishing to fill their refrigerator a little bit. Chopper, Usopp and Karu, somehow, were the ones doing it. However, it didn't work too well primarily because of all of them being idiots, so later Usopp and Luffy used Karu as a bait to try to catch something big, hopefully a sea king, that was what Usopp said. Then the ship passed through some kind of strange mist, one of the many odd phenomenons of the Grand Line. Unknown to another ship also passed the mist, but from the opposite side. As they left the mist, they noticed a man clinging to Karu's neck. They all looked at each other and blinked a few times. "Bone-chan," thought Luffy. "I've missed you." Clinging to the duck was a strange man with short black hair and a lot of makeup on his face. He had blue medieval-looking clothes, pink ballet shoes, as well as a pink coat with two swan decorations in the shape of number 2 on his shoulders. "Oh my!" Mr. 2 shouted. "Why am I clinging to this spot-billed duck when I've only met him?" But that he released the duck, but since he didn't expect there to be sea underneath, he was in for quite a surprise. "Help me please. I'm a hammer," he yelled as he sank. The straw hats of course saved him. He sat down on the deck on the ship, his clothes completely soaked, and thanked them. "Oh, I thought it was all over." "No, really. Swan, Bone Blade began. "But my life was saved by pirates that I do not know. I won't forget your kindness." He bowed to them. Then his eyes wandered to Vivi. "Well, aren't you a cute one? You're just my type," he told her and blew her a kiss. Vivi shook her head. What a strange guy. How can such an outfit possibly fit a guy? Luffy thought to himself as he looked at Bone-chan. And yet it does. "Hey, you can't swim, right? Do you have a devil fruit?" Luffy asked him aloud. He nodded. "You're so right. I suppose I can show you, since you saved me." Bentham sang out and stood up, moving his body in a very feminine fashion. "There's no rush, so I might as well put on a show. Prepare to witness my ability," he yelled out, but then he struck Luffy with the palm of his hand, sending him into the nearby railing. Everyone nearly panicked, thinking he was attacking. Zoro took out his swords. Mr. 2 however shook his hands in front of his face in denial of the accusation. Wait, yo," he yelled, and everyone could hear that his voice was changed. As Bentham moved his hands away, everyone stared in shock. He looked exactly like Luffy. "Stop joking around," Mr. 2 yelled out in Luffy's voice. Surprised you. Jahahaha. "When I touch myself with my left hand," he said, and did that. "See, back to normal. That's the ability I gained with the main no me." Luffy then stood up and the hat shadowed his face. Everyone of the crew cringed, knowing what kind of mood Luffy was since morning. Cool. Luffy finally beamed and everyone released a breath that they didn't know they were holding. Bentham, who was oblivious to the exchange, proceeded to touch everyone's face while they were back at gaping at his ability. "Well, there's no real need to hit anybody though," he announced. "Hi. Look at me," he said and touched his face with his right hand, changing into Usopp. If I touch my face he changed into Zoro. With my right hand he changed into Chopper. I can imitate anyone. Just like this. He said and changed into Nami. Even the body. He told them and unbuttoned his shirt. Usopp, Chopper and Luffy all stared at Nami's features, but soon Nami's punch knocked Mr. 2 on the ground. Cut that out. She yelled at him furiously. A single droop of blood exited Luffy's nose. Damn. So cool. He screamed with stars in his eyes. Well, I'm sorry to say that I can't show you any more of my abilities. Bone Clay told them as he sat down again. They of course convinced him otherwise, so he showed them a few of the faces he has saved. Among them a few very weird ones, but also the face of Vivi's father, which shocked and horrified the princess. The four immediately became fast friends and danced around on the deck. Then Mr. 2's ship arrived to take him back. Oh. My time to leave has come. How tragic. Bentham announced. They begged him not to go, but to no avail. Do not be sad. Journeys and partings go hand in hand. But remember this. To true friendship how long you've known each other means nothing. Don't cry for me. He told them. They waved him goodbye and he jumped on his ship. Now let's go, boys. Bentham announced to his crew. Aye, Mr. 2 Bone Clay Sama. The crew answered. Wide. That is the end, so thanks for watching. Comment down below with recommendations on what fanfic I should do next. And remember to like and subscribe to my channel.